Imagine standing in a design office in 1943, the blackout curtains drawn, blueprints spread beneath a single lamp. On the paper, a twin-jet medium bomber concept no one is yet authorized to build. Britain is still locked in piston-engine warfare, but a handful of engineers are already designing for the next one. By mid-1943, the Royal Air Force was still fighting a war powered by pistons and propellers. The Lancaster, Halifax, and Mosquito dominated the skies of Europe, and their factories worked around the clock to sustain the bombing offensive. Yet inside a few design offices, de Havilland at Hatfield, English Electric in Preston, and the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, engineers were already looking beyond the horizon of the current war. They studied the implications of the new turbojet engines being refined by Frank Whittle's team and by Rolls-Royce, engines that promised continuous thrust without propeller drag, and speeds that could render conventional intercepts obsolete. The concept taking shape on those drafts was audacious, a bomber that could outrun fighters, not outgun them. The physics of jet propulsion offered a theoretical leap forward, sustained cruise at over 450 miles per hour and altitudes exceeding 40,000 feet. But for Britain, exhausted by the industrial demands of the war, it was a gamble. Resources were strained, and design offices were instructed to prioritize aircraft that could be fielded within months, not years. Still, preliminary studies began, sometimes unofficially, under vague designations such as DH.99 or a .1, placeholder names for an undefined future requirement. Much of the early work came from aerodynamic lessons learned from the de Havilland Vampire, one of the first British jets to fly. Engineers recognized that scaling up a jet fighter into a bomber was not as simple as enlarging the airframe. Jet engines consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and range was a constant limitation. To carry meaningful payloads, the new bomber would require thin, high-aspect wings for efficiency and pressurization for long missions at high altitude. These were not incremental modifications. They demanded an entirely new design philosophy. The early drawings reveal transitional thinking, twin engines buried within the wing roots to reduce drag, a streamlined fuselage with a glazed nose, and a tricycle undercarriage for stability during takeoff. The intent was clear. This would not be a heavy bomber in the Lancaster sense, but a fast, medium-class jet capable of precision strikes. It would be lighter, faster, and more adaptable, carrying a modest 4,000-pound bomb load rather than the vast arsenals of the wartime giants. In 1943, such ideas existed only on paper, but they reflected a subtle shift in doctrine. The RAF's Bomber Command had proven the strategic value of bombing. Now the air staff began to imagine how jets could transform it. The challenge was institutional as much as technical. Within the ministry, jet propulsion was still considered experimental, and few officers believed it could be integrated into a combat aircraft of bomber size. The first jet fighters had barely achieved reliable flight, and their engines suffered from short lifespans and erratic performance. Yet the same skepticism surrounded radar and pressurization only a few years earlier. The urgency of wartime innovation often moved faster than policy could follow. As engineers refined their drafts, the blackout sirens outside reminded them that the present war still raged on. Britain's cities continued to burn under V1 attacks, and the notion of building a jet bomber for a war that might end before its completion seemed detached from reality. Yet for those few designers, the effort was not about the immediate campaign. It was about ensuring that, when the next war came, if it came, Britain would not be left behind in propulsion, speed, or altitude. The blueprints would remain hidden for years, locked in ministry archives labeled Experimental Medium Jet Bomber Studies. But within those lines, the sweep of the wings, the nacelle contours, the careful balance of thrust and weight, lay the genesis of a concept that would eventually take flight as the English Electric Canberra. A bomber designed for 1945, born instead into the jet age. A memo stamped most secret crosses desks at the Air Ministry. Specification B.345 is issued, a requirement for a jet-powered bomber capable of carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs at 500 miles per hour. Few realize it marks the birth of Britain's post-war bomber line. By early 1945, Britain's air planners were already thinking beyond the war they were still fighting. The piston-engine bombers of the day had reached their limits. Faster German night fighters were taking an increasing toll, and higher altitudes brought diminishing returns. The newly founded Directorate of Technical Development had begun compiling future combat requirements, and among them, one stood out for its audacity: an all-jet medium bomber capable of outrunning any enemy fighter in existence. The requirement would be issued under the Air Ministry's Project Code B.345, a bureaucratic shorthand that belied its revolutionary intent. The document was concise, just a few pages outlining speed, altitude, and payload expectations. Yet within its lines lay an entirely new philosophy. No defensive armament was specified, no mention of turrets or gunners. Instead, survival was to be achieved through performance: a clean airframe, minimal drag, and thrust sufficient to carry 4,000 pounds of bombs to a target at 500 miles per hour. The implication was clear. In the jet age, evasion would replace armor. The bomber would live or die by its speed alone. Behind this directive stood Air Commodore R.E. Bishop, one of the Air Ministry's leading advocates for jet integration. Drawing on intelligence about Germany's Arado R-234 Blitz, the world's first operational jet bomber, Bishop and his staff saw the need to leapfrog existing designs. Britain had pioneered the jet fighter with the Gloucester Meteor, but the bomber arm had no equivalent. The Arado's brief combat record, striking targets in the dying months of the war, demonstrated that jets could operate as strike aircraft with near impunity. B.345 was Britain's formal answer. Distribution of the specification went to a select few manufacturers: de Havilland, Avro, Vickers, and a lesser-known company with large wartime production capacity, English Electric. Each was invited to submit design studies. Some interpreted the brief conservatively, proposing to adapt existing airframes for jet propulsion. Others, notably de Havilland and English Electric, saw an opportunity to start from a clean sheet. Their design offices began work almost immediately, though progress was constrained by material shortages and the continued focus on finishing the war in Europe. The directive also reflected a subtle shift within British defense thinking. Until 1944, the bomber had been viewed primarily as an instrument of strategic destruction: large, heavily armed formations delivering vast payloads over cities. B.345 implied something new: a fast, surgical platform, operating at high altitude and high speed, striking with precision rather than volume. The emerging technology of radar bombing and early navigation aids like GH and oboe made such precision feasible. The bomber, once the sledgehammer of war, was about to become a scalpel. In committee meetings at the Air Ministry, debates raged over feasibility. Could existing jet engines sustain such missions? Would the fuel load make the aircraft too heavy to achieve the required performance? Rolls-Royce representatives argued that the Derwent and the forthcoming Nene could deliver the necessary thrust, but at the cost of range. The engineers were confident that aerodynamic efficiency, not engine size, would be the key. The air staff agreed, and the specification stood as written: performance first, everything else second. As the war wound toward its conclusion, few noticed the quiet significance of specification B.345. It was not a wartime emergency measure, nor a response to any particular front. It was a blueprint for a future Britain, one that expected to remain a global air power in the uncertain years to come. The document's ink was barely dry when design sketches began circulating between Hatfield and Preston, setting in motion the next chapter of Britain's aviation story. A single Air Ministry file number B.345 had opened the door to the jet bomber age. The test stand at Hatfield shrieks as the de Havilland Goblin turbojet ignites. Mechanics flinch at the sound, high, metallic, unearthly. It is smaller than Whittle's centrifugal engines but steadier, more efficient, and it will power the nation's first jet fighters, and perhaps its first jet bomber. The Goblin engine, officially designated the Halford H.1, represented a turning point in British propulsion design. Created under the direction of Frank Halford, a former Napier engineer, it stripped jet propulsion down to its most practical form: a single-stage centrifugal compressor, a straight-through combustion chamber, and a single turbine stage. Where Whittle's early designs demanded complex fuel and airflow balancing, Halford's approach was elegant and production-minded. By 1943, the Goblin was already running at 3,000 pounds of thrust, a remarkable figure for its size and weight. At the Hatfield test bays, these early engines ran day and night. The engineers kept meticulous logs: exhaust gas temperatures, vibration frequencies, turbine blade stress under load. Failures were frequent: compressor bursts, bearing seizures, and combustion instability were all part of the process. But each failure revealed the limits of metallurgy and design tolerances that would soon be overcome. The team's goal was reliability, not just raw thrust. A bomber, unlike a fighter, needed sustained operation for hours, not minutes. The Goblin's first successful flight came in 1943 aboard the de Havilland Vampire prototype, marking Britain's second operational jet aircraft. The compact engine fit neatly within the fuselage nacelles, freeing the aircraft from the aerodynamic constraints of piston engines. Its smooth, vibration-free power delivery astonished test pilots accustomed to the rhythmic hammering of propellers. De Havilland's engineers knew they had found the propulsion core for a new generation of aircraft, not only fighters, but also experimental bombers envisioned under specification B.345. While the Goblin's output was promising, it remained underpowered for a fully loaded bomber. De Havilland was already developing its successor, the Ghost, with projected thrust nearing 5,000 pounds. The Air Ministry watched these advances closely, noting that a twin Ghost installation could theoretically meet the performance targets outlined for the B.345 jet bomber. In internal correspondence, engineers speculated that two Ghosts could power a clean, mid-wing bomber to nearly 480 miles per hour, placing it beyond the reach of most interceptors of the era. Every test run at Hatfield carried an undercurrent of strategy. Britain's jet technology was advancing, but the Germans were already fielding the Arado R-234, powered by twin Junkers Jumo 4 engines. The Goblin's smooth operation contrasted sharply with the temperamental German units, which suffered from short turbine life and chronic overheating. British engineers understood that durability, not just innovation, would define post-war dominance in jet propulsion. In the narrow corridors of de Havilland's design office, the discussion turned from engines to airframes. If a single Goblin could lift a fighter cleanly, could two carry a bomber of moderate size? Preliminary calculations suggested yes, with trade-offs. Fuel consumption would limit range, and payload would remain modest, but the concept was viable. The team began sketching airframes with twin-engine nacelles buried close to the fuselage to reduce drag. The same men designing the Vampire fighter's graceful twin booms now traced out the outlines of a bomber variant, DH.99, the company's unapproved but persistent side project. At this stage, official backing was uncertain. The Goblin's success had secured de Havilland's reputation as a jet innovator, but government focus still leaned toward operational fighters. Yet Halford and his engineers kept refining their data, knowing that any future bomber program would depend on proven, reliable propulsion. The Goblin was not merely an engine, it was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that a jet powerplant could deliver predictable thrust, tolerate extended operation, and be manufactured at scale. As 1944 approached, the scream of the Goblin engine became a familiar sound over Hatfield. To those who worked nearby, it was the sound of progress, not the clatter of war but the whistle of the future. Beneath the high-pitched resonance of metal and air, a quiet truth was forming. Britain now possessed the means to power a bomber that no piston aircraft could hope to catch. The Goblin had given Britain its voice in the jet age. Soon, engineers would give that voice wings. In a corner of Hatfield's design department, Geoffrey de Havilland's team sketches a twin-engine bomber based on their fighter jet experience. The airframe, designated DH.99, shares lineage with the Vampire, but with a pressurized cockpit, larger wings, and a belly built for ordnance. Officially, it doesn't exist. By 1944, the war was nearing its decisive phase, but de Havilland's engineers were already working in a different time frame. They were one of the few British firms with practical jet experience, having brought the Vampire to life just months after Whittle's first successful trials. The logical next step was to apply those lessons to a fast, medium bomber, something that could deliver a small but meaningful payload at unprecedented speeds. Yet such an idea had no official sponsor. The Air Ministry was focused on fighters and finishing the war in Europe. So, the team at Hatfield pursued it quietly, under internal funding and in off hours, a technical experiment disguised as a derivative study. The DH.99 concept reflected both ambition and pragmatism. Its structure drew on the Vampire's modular layout, twin booms for tail stability, a central fuselage pod for crew and armament, and mid-mounted wings for lift efficiency. But unlike the Vampire, the bomber's fuselage was to be fully pressurized, allowing operations above 40,000 feet. The wing area increased by nearly one-third to accommodate greater fuel volume, and the airframe was designed around twin Halford Ghost engines rather than the smaller Goblins. Each engine would deliver roughly 5,000 pounds of thrust, providing the thrust-to-weight ratio necessary to meet the 500 mph goal outlined in Specification B.345. Within de Havilland's design office, engineers confronted the central paradox of jet bombers. The faster the aircraft, the shorter the range. Fuel density, not payload, became the limiting factor. Jet propulsion consumed fuel at rates that no wartime logistic network could yet sustain. The DH.99's internal capacity was estimated at 1,200 gallons, enough for roughly 2 hours of flight at cruise. For post-war missions, that was acceptable. For wartime strategic operations, it was not. Nonetheless, the Hatfield team persisted, knowing that propulsion efficiency and airframe refinement would only improve in the years ahead. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the company's chief test pilot, followed the work with interest. His experience with early jet flight informed the bomber's control design: wide undercarriage stance for stability, powerful air brakes for descent control, and side-by-side seating for a two-man crew to share navigation and bombing duties. The design retained the firm's signature aesthetic: clean lines, minimal drag, and aerodynamic purity. Every contour of the fuselage was designed with a single purpose: speed through efficiency. When preliminary drawings were presented to the Ministry of Aircraft Production, the response was polite but non-committal. Britain's priority remained short-range fighters and transport aircraft to support final operations over Europe and the Pacific. The DH.99, it was noted, was technically promising but of limited immediate utility. Still, the ministry agreed to keep the studies on file, linking them informally to the broader B.345 program, then circulating between competing manufacturers. Despite official indifference, de Havilland pressed on with wooden models and airflow tests in the company's private wind tunnel. Results confirmed what the engineers suspected. The configuration was sound. Stability across Mach 0.7 was excellent, and drag coefficients were lower than those of any contemporary bomber design. The challenge, as always, was scaling production once peace returned, finding materials, funding, and strategic justification for an aircraft no longer required to fight an ongoing war. By the closing months of 1944, the DH.99 project existed as an engineering curiosity, a vision suspended between eras. It was too advanced for wartime budgets and too embryonic for post-war planning. Yet within its lines lay the DNA of the jet bomber that would eventually emerge under another name and under another company's stewardship. The gamble had been made not for immediate reward, but for the future of British flight. Across England, another firm responds. English Electric, previously known for license builds, now sees an opening to design its first original aircraft. Their submission for B.345 is leaner, faster, and more ambitious. It will later evolve into the .1, the prototype of the Canberra. In 1944, English Electric was not a household name in aircraft design. During the war, it had produced vast numbers of Hampton bombers and later worked as a subcontractor, assembling parts for other manufacturers. Yet inside its facilities at Preston and Samlesbury lay an untapped resource. Hundreds of skilled draftsmen, aerodynamicists, and production engineers, most of whom were about to face peacetime redundancy. When Specification B.345 reached the company through the Air Ministry's procurement chain, English Electric's management saw a rare opportunity, not merely to build, but to design. The company's technical director, W.W.I. was recruited from Westland Aircraft, where he had led the design of the high-performance Whirlwind and Welkin fighters. Petter brought with him a reputation for uncompromising engineering and an instinct for aerodynamic clarity. To him, the new specification was not just a post-war study. It was the key to establishing English Electric as a major aircraft designer. He assembled a small design team at Wharton, a former RAF maintenance base in Lancashire, and began shaping what would become one of Britain's most successful jet airframes. Petter's design philosophy was direct: efficiency through simplicity. Where other firms proposed adaptations of piston bombers retrofitted for jets, Petter insisted on a purpose-built airframe, a high-aspect, straight-wing monoplane with two engines embedded in the wing roots to reduce drag and structural weight. His early sketches bore little resemblance to the lumbering bombers of the recent war. The fuselage was slim and cylindrical, tapering smoothly to a cruciform tail. The cockpit canopy was to be pressurized and set high for excellent visibility. The entire aircraft would be built around clean aerodynamics and ease of maintenance, with modular sections allowing rapid access to engines and fuel systems. For propulsion, the design initially incorporated Rolls-Royce Derwent V turbojets, the most reliable engines available. Later projections indicated that the forthcoming Rolls-Royce Avon could increase performance dramatically, pushing the aircraft toward transonic speed. Petter's estimates were bold: a service ceiling of 48,000 feet, a range exceeding 1,000 miles, and a cruise speed of 470 knots. These figures placed the English Electric proposal at the forefront of all B.345 contenders. The Air Ministry's Technical Evaluation Committee noted the design's clarity and conservative practicality. No swept wings, no experimental features that might delay production. Petter believed that straight wings offered better load-carrying characteristics at moderate speeds, an approach supported by post-war aerodynamic data from Farnborough. It was not the most radical proposal on paper, but it was the most achievable. Meanwhile, other firms approached the specification from different angles. De Havilland's DH.99 offered continuity with proven jet components, while Avro's studies leaned toward scaled-down versions of heavy bomber concepts. In comparative trials of wind tunnel data, English Electric's design consistently achieved lower drag coefficients and superior handling characteristics. The ministry's internal reports began referring to it as the most promising light bomber type. Through 1945, while de Havilland's attention shifted toward commercial jet transport and fighter development, English Electric's small team pressed ahead. They built scale models, calculated stress loads, and refined weight distribution until every parameter satisfied the ministry's requirement. The result was a balanced design that combined performance, simplicity, and manufacturability, a rare alignment in post-war aviation. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, English Electric had already submitted final drawings for review. The war ended before a prototype could be authorized, but the company's quiet perseverance ensured that, when the ministry revived jet bomber development in 1946, there was already a proven design waiting on the table. The .1, as it was coded in its prototype phase, would later bear the name Canberra. Yet its lineage traced directly to these months at Wharton, to the moment when an untested company, guided by a handful of engineers and one clear directive, transformed from a wartime subcontractor into the architect of Britain's first true jet bomber. By early 1945, the Air Ministry faced a paradox. Engines were advancing faster than the aircraft meant to carry them. Rolls-Royce's Derwent and Nene turbojets were delivering thrust beyond the expectations of their designers, yet few airframes were ready to exploit their potential. Britain stood at a technological crossroads, rich in propulsion, but poor in platforms. Jet propulsion, once a theoretical novelty, had matured with startling speed. The Derwent V, evolved from the original Whittle design, now produced 3,500 pounds of thrust, while the larger Nene promised more than 5,000. These figures represented a quantum leap from the piston engines, then powering bombers like the Lancaster and Halifax. Yet with the war's demands still centered on proven types, there were few opportunities to pair these engines with new aircraft. The RAF had committed its resources to closing the conflict in Europe, leaving the emerging jet sector to operate on the fringes of the military-industrial complex. In the test cells at Rolls-Royce, Derby, engineers logged thousands of hours refining compressor tolerances, fuel control systems, and turbine alloys. Their reports described a curious frustration: engines ready for flight, but no suitable aircraft awaiting installation. Test data suggested that a twin Nene installation could propel a 45,000-pound bomber to speeds once thought impossible. Yet not a single prototype existed to verify the claim. De Havilland's Ghost engine was following a similar trajectory, pushing steadily toward greater power and efficiency, but airframes lagged behind due to material shortages and shifting priorities. The result was a period of suspended progress, where paper specifications outpaced physical construction. The Ministry of Aircraft Production encouraged the continued refinement of powerplants, confident that suitable aircraft would follow. But as 1945 progressed, it became evident that the balance had tipped too far. Britain was building engines in search of airframes, a reversal of the traditional development process that left designers struggling to catch up. At Farnborough, aerodynamicists tested generic fuselage shapes and nacelle configurations to provide data for whichever company advanced first. They experimented with intake geometries, thrust line placements, and fuel flow systems, creating a shared body of knowledge that would eventually inform all early jet bombers. This research revealed key truths. Engines must be mounted close to the fuselage to reduce bending moments, and straight wings, though less glamorous than swept designs, provided optimal lift at subsonic speeds. These findings would later define the configuration of English Electric's .1 prototype. The shortage of compatible airframes also exposed logistical challenges. Turbojet engines consumed fuel at extraordinary rates, up to 4 times that of piston types at takeoff power. To sustain long-range missions, bombers would need far larger internal tanks or external drop systems, both of which required airframe redesigns. Metallurgy, too, presented hurdles. Jet engines generated sustained heat far beyond the tolerance of conventional aluminum alloys, demanding new steels and heat-resistant coatings that were still under experimental production. Amid these technical barriers, a deeper concern emerged within the Air Ministry. Time. Intelligence from Germany confirmed operational use of the Arado R-234 Blitz, a twinjet bomber already striking Allied positions. Britain's engineers, though confident in their technology, had yet to field an equivalent. The political and symbolic implications were clear. Britain had pioneered jet flight, but was now trailing in its weaponization. To bridge the gap, experimental programs were authorized to pair existing engines with modified airframes. Hybrid testbeds that could yield data until purpose-built designs matured. De Havilland fitted Goblin engines to modified Mosquitoes. Gloucester mounted Derwents on test wings. None were intended for combat, but they provided vital handling and systems experience for the next generation. By the war's final months, Britain's engine builders had achieved what only a handful of nations could claim: reliable, mass-producible jet propulsion. Yet the aircraft capable of carrying these engines, bombers to match their promise, remained unbuilt. The sky belonged to engines without airframes, a momentary imbalance that would soon drive the birth of Britain's first true jet bomber. In the stillness of hangars across Derby and Hatfield, engines roared with nowhere yet to go. Captured intelligence reports on the Arado R-234 Blitz reach London. The Germans have fielded the world's first operational jet bomber, a sleek, twin-engine machine that outran Allied interceptors. The urgency sharpens. Britain cannot end the war behind in propulsion. In the spring of 1945, the fragments of the Reich were being combed by Allied technical teams. Among the wreckage near Rain, Grove, and Wessel lay something that drew immediate attention: a small number of intact R-234s, their swept nacelles scorched but largely intact. The reports that followed shocked British analysts. Here was an aircraft capable of 460 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, carrying a 1,000-kilogram bomb load, powered by two Jumo 4B turbojets. The Arado had not changed the course of the war, but it had proven something undeniable. Jet-powered bombing was not only possible, it was operational. The Air Ministry's Technical Intelligence Summary No. 298, issued in May 1945, catalogued the R-234's characteristics in detail. It described a revolutionary concept: a bomber so fast that it required no defensive armament, one that relied entirely on speed and altitude to survive. The parallels with Britain's specification B.345 were immediate and unsettling. What the Air Ministry had only theorized in early 1945, Germany had already flown in combat. Photographs and captured documents revealed how far the Germans had taken the concept. The R-234 employed a high-mounted straight wing, twin turbojets slung beneath the roots, and a narrow pressurized cockpit for a single pilot. Its operational history was brief but significant: reconnaissance over the Ardennes, nuisance raids over Antwerp and the Remagen bridgehead, and late-war night operations that defied Allied interception. In the closing months, the Luftwaffe used it as a fast reconnaissance platform, taking photographs of Allied positions with impunity. These missions provided empirical proof of what British theorists had only suspected: that speed alone could serve as protection. At Farnborough, captured Arados were reassembled and test-flown under RAF markings. Flight reports from RAE Farnborough noted stable handling, moderate acceleration, and clean aerodynamics, though hampered by the unreliable Jumo 4 engines. Their turbine blades, made from low-grade steel due to wartime shortages, lasted scarcely 10 hours. Despite these shortcomings, the aircraft's overall design impressed engineers. Its layout, proportions, and operational logic validated every principle underpinning the B.345 specification. The effect on British planning was immediate. The Air Ministry convened a post-war jet bomber conference, inviting representatives from Rolls-Royce, de Havilland, Avro, and English Electric to study the captured data. The conclusion was unanimous. The concept was sound, but British execution must surpass it in reliability and range. Rolls-Royce's engines already exceeded the Jumo's output and lifespan, giving Britain a tangible advantage, if only an airframe could be produced in time. The intelligence files also revealed the limitations of Germany's pioneering effort. The Arado's small bomb bay, limited payload, and fragile landing gear underscored its status as a prototype pressed into war. The Luftwaffe's collapsing infrastructure prevented the design from evolving further, leaving its potential largely unrealized. To British eyes, this was not a cause for complacency but a warning. Whoever refined the jet bomber first in peacetime would shape the balance of aerial power for decades to come. In the months following the German surrender, British engineers examined the R-234 alongside the Messerschmitt Me-262, dissecting their components for clues. The lessons were unmistakable. Jet propulsion was no longer experimental. It was now a requirement of modern air warfare. The Germans had proven the concept under fire. The Allies would perfect it in laboratories and test ranges. As the war in Europe ended, the blueprints of the Arado were quietly stored in British archives, but the shadow it cast stretched across every design office in the country. The message it carried was simple and inescapable. The jet bomber was real, and Britain could not afford to be second again. The race for the post-war sky had begun. At Farnborough, technicians suspend 1/24-scale mock-ups in a tunnel of roaring air. The models, de Havilland's DH.99 and English Electric's A.1, undergo airflow visualization with smoke and oil tracers. Results show both are viable, but the A.1 promises better stability at altitude. The Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, had become Britain's central proving ground for ideas that could not yet exist at full scale. Here, the future took shape in balsa wood, resin, and polished aluminum, shapes no one had yet flown, but which would determine how the next decade of air power would look. The wind tunnels, relics of the 1930s expanded for wartime research, could simulate airflow at speeds approaching Mach 0.8, enough to expose the first signs of compressibility that would plague early jets. Engineers from de Havilland and English Electric arrived with their models packed in wooden crates, each wrapped in cloth and labeled experimental bomber studies. The sessions were formal, documented to the minute, every run logged by number, every observation sketched. The RAE teams injected vaporized oil into the airstream to trace flow separation, watching the patterns swirl and break over wings, nacelles, and tail surfaces. Cameras recorded each pass in high-speed film for later analysis. These were not mere demonstrations. They were the proving ground of Britain's jet doctrine. De Havilland's DH.99 showed elegant handling characteristics. Its twin-boom layout provided excellent directional stability, but the tailplane sat directly in the exhaust flow, a problem that produced unpredictable buffeting at higher simulated speeds. English Electric's design, in contrast, employed a single fuselage with engines buried in the wing roots. This configuration produced cleaner airflow and lower interference drag. Data sheets from late 1945 record a drag coefficient nearly 10% lower than the DH.99 model, a decisive margin in performance terms. The RAE's aerodynamicists recommended several refinements: slightly increased wing sweep for compressibility relief, repositioned air intakes, and revised tail geometry to prevent airflow blanking during high-angle climbs. Petter's English Electric team adopted these changes almost immediately, revising their drawings before the next ministry review. De Havilland's engineers noted the same issues but faced growing pressure from within their own company, which was shifting its focus toward the Comet jet airliner project and the Vampire's production. Quietly, attention began to consolidate around English Electric's proposal. Beyond the technical data, the tests revealed a philosophical divergence. De Havilland's design carried the aesthetic of wartime fighters, elegant but specialized. English Electric's prototype, by contrast, was built around efficiency and modularity, with straight wings designed for stable high-altitude flight and broad internal fuel capacity. It was an aircraft conceived not for a single mission, but for adaptability, reconnaissance, bombing, and later, even nuclear delivery. That flexibility would prove crucial as post-war doctrine evolved. The RAE's reports, circulated under limited distribution in 1946, concluded that the English Electric configuration offered the most promise for rapid development within existing material limits. With those words, the future of Britain's jet bomber effort quietly shifted. A company with no prior design heritage had earned the confidence of the ministry's most demanding analysts. The next phase, prototype authorization, would depend on budget, politics, and timing. For the men in the tunnel gallery, however, the results spoke clearly. They had watched air swirl around wings that did not yet exist, measured lift on an aircraft still confined to paper, and proven that Britain's jet bomber could, in theory, fly. When the tunnel motors fell silent and the smoke trails cleared, the future hung in still air, a silent promise etched in the wake of miniature wings. The war had ended, but Britain was broke. The Treasury tightened every valve of spending, and the Ministry of Supply, successor to the wartime aircraft directorates, now had to choose what aviation projects would live and which would die. On paper, the jet bomber program was visionary. On the balance sheet, it was indulgent. In 1946, as demobilization swept through the services, the air staff faced a new kind of battle. One fought not with squadrons but with budgets. The Air Estimates Committee convened at Whitehall that spring, reviewing every experimental program still drawing funds from wartime allocations. Propulsion research remained untouchable. Jet engines were clearly the nation's future export. But the idea of a new bomber, especially one without a defined enemy, demanded justification. Germany was defeated, and the Soviet Union, though formidable, was still a wartime ally. In a world trying to rebuild, a jet bomber seemed an answer without a question. Yet inside the Air Ministry's Operational Requirements Division, some argued that strategic reach must never lapse. They pointed to the changing shape of warfare, the atomic age now dawning across the Atlantic. The United States had demonstrated a new kind of deterrence with the B-29 and the bomb it carried. If Britain was to remain a world power, it would need an aircraft capable of delivering a weapon of equal consequence. The ministry began quietly phrasing its jet bomber proposal in those terms. It was no longer just a replacement for piston engine types. It was a platform for the post-war deterrent. Still, the accountants were unmoved. Minutes from the September 1946 Treasury Review record a simple objection. The nation is financially exhausted. The development of new bombers must be deferred pending consolidation of present types. In practice, this meant that only one project could proceed, and only at reduced pace. The question was which? English Electric's engineers submitted their revised proposal that autumn, now labeled a .1, B.3/45. It was smaller and more economical than rival designs, using existing components wherever possible. The design made efficient use of two Rolls-Royce Nene engines and shared systems commonality with ongoing jet fighter programs. In an environment obsessed with savings, this became a strength. The Air Ministry's evaluation described the .1 as a practicable compromise between ambition and austerity. By late 1946, official authorization was finally granted for two prototypes. Funding was meager, just enough for airframe construction and initial flight testing. There would be no spare parts, no redundancies, no allowance for failure. Every rivet and sheet of alloy had to be accounted for. English Electric converted a corner of its Wharton plant, formerly an assembly site for the Canberra's piston engine predecessors, into a jet research division. The company's transformation from subcontractor to prime contractor began not with triumph, but with restraint. The politics of the project became as complex as its engineering. The ministry required quarterly progress reports, each cross-examined by Treasury observers. The Royal Aircraft Establishment demanded access to test data for independent verification. The air staff wanted performance projections tied to operational roles. Every document passed through half a dozen desks before a single bolt was ordered. Progress was slow but steady. In this bureaucratic labyrinth, WWII, English Electric's chief designer, became the quiet anchor. He understood the necessity of compromise, that in post-war Britain, engineering would advance only as fast as budgets allowed. His design philosophy reflected that realism: clean aerodynamics, accessible systems, and modular construction. If resources were scarce, every component had to justify its existence. The aircraft would be simple, robust, and efficient, and it would fly. By the end of 1947, funding had been renewed and work on the first prototype, VN 799, was underway. Britain's first true jet bomber was beginning to take shape, not through extravagance or speed, but through persistence inside a system that doubted its need. The future of British air power was now measured not in miles per hour, but in budget lines and signatures. In a drafty hangar at Wharton Aerodrome, the first aluminum frames of prototype VN 799 began to rise from trestles. Sheets of light alloy, still smelling faintly of coolant from the rolling mill, were riveted into shape around a skeleton of spars and longerons. After years of paper studies and scale models, the jet bomber was finally becoming real, one rib, one nacelle, one bulkhead at a time. The English Electric A.1, conceived under specification B.345, was a study in disciplined engineering. Nothing about it was extravagant. Every curve and contour served a purpose. Its wings, straight and mid-mounted, housed two Rolls-Royce Nene Mk.1 turbojets in buried nacelles, a configuration chosen for aerodynamic cleanliness and center of gravity balance. The fuselage was tubular and pressurized, accommodating a crew of two under a framed canopy. The bomb bay, designed to carry up to 6,000 pounds, occupied the aircraft's center section, with fuel cells stretching through the wing roots to preserve internal space. The projected maximum speed was around 470 mph, a figure that, if achieved, would make it the fastest bomber in existence. Assembly began in early 1948 under guarded optimism. The war's urgency was gone, replaced by procedural caution. Every subassembly had to pass inspection by Ministry of Supply overseers. Material shortages still lingered. Steel fasteners and precision tubing were rationed, and English Electric often had to trade surplus parts from retired Mosquito production lines to acquire what it needed. Yet the work continued without pause. The men at Wharton, many veterans of wartime production, now found themselves crafting a machine unlike anything they had built before. The internal ducts, the heat shielding, and the fuel control systems all spoke to a new era of flight. The Nene engines arrived from Rolls-Royce's Derby facility encased in wooden transport frames. Technicians unboxed them like artifacts from the future. Compact, streamlined turbines that promised performance no piston engine could match. Each unit was bench-tested, and then carefully mounted within its wing bay, its intake geometry verified against RAE drawings. The precision of fit was remarkable. Only a few thousandths of an inch separated the nacelle lining from the engine casing. The installation marked the moment when the aircraft ceased being an assembly and began becoming an aeroplane. By mid-year, the fuselage had been skinned, control surfaces installed, and hydraulic lines threaded through the frame. The cockpit, though narrow, was ergonomically clean, a reflection of Petter's fighter design background. 2 Martin Baker ejection seats were specified for later production, though the prototype retained conventional escape hatches. The canopy was fitted in June, its perspex polished to clarity by hand. For the first time, the engineers could stand back and see the .1's full form, compact, swept with purpose, and unmistakably jet-borne. Throughout 1948, the project remained classified. Officially, it was an experimental high-speed bomber test vehicle. Only a handful of officers within the Air Ministry knew its true significance. Visiting officials remarked on its proportions, smaller than expected, yet exuding potential energy. One noted that it looked fast even standing still, an observation Petter neither confirmed nor denied. Taxi trials were planned for the autumn, once systems integration was complete. The airframe's fuel tanks were pressure tested, the electrical circuits verified, and the flight instruments calibrated. Outside, the Wharton airfield, once a wartime assembly line, became a proving ground again. The prototype was towed into sunlight for the first time in September 1948, its silver skin reflecting the light of a Britain still rebuilding. The jet bomber that had once existed only as a secret directive now stood on its landing gear, tangible and waiting. Engineers paused to watch as ground crews attached fuel hoses. The aircraft's smooth flanks bore no markings yet, only the stenciled serial VN 799 and the faint pencil lines from the draftsman who had drawn it. The noise of the hangar fell away. For the first time, there was no question whether Britain could build a jet bomber, only whether it could fly. The stage was set for the first ignition of the engines, and for Britain's next step into the jet age. The morning of May 2, 1949, broke clear over Wharton Aerodrome. Mechanics rolled fuel drums across the tarmac as the first prototype, VN 799, was wheeled from its hangar. The aircraft gleamed under the northern sun, its aluminum skin catching light along every rivet line. After 6 years of design studies, drafts, and budget skirmishes, Britain's first jet bomber was ready to breathe. The first objective was simple: bring the engines to life. Rolls-Royce engineers, flown in from Derby, worked alongside English Electric technicians to prepare the Nene Mk.1 turbojets for ground tests. Twin air hoses fed compressed air into the starters, while the fuel system was primed and vented for leaks. Ground crews checked the jet pipes with mirrors to confirm there were no obstructions or loose debris, a standard practice that carried new weight in the age of jet propulsion. Fire crews stood by, a reminder of how untested the entire procedure remained. At 09:17 hours, the starter whined and caught. The Port Nene spooled up first, its rising note a high, metallic whir that deepened into a clean, steady roar. The starboard engine followed seconds later. The exhaust shimmered in the cool morning air, distorting the hangar behind it. The airframe quivered, not violently, but with the subdued vibration of a living machine. For the first time, a British-built jet bomber stood under its own power. Instrumentation readings were taken continuously. Jet pipe temperatures stabilized at 580 degrees C, and oil pressures held within nominal limits. The Nenes responded smoothly to throttle movement, confirming fuel control synchronization. Engineers noted minor resonances through the airframe at mid-throttle, likely a function of nacelle harmonics, not structural issues. After 12 minutes of stable operation, both engines were shut down for inspection. When the whine faded, the silence that followed was electric. The aircraft had passed its first trial without fault. Over the following weeks, the ground tests expanded. Engineers performed repeated engine runs, calibrating thrust output and checking the structural loads transmitted through the wings. Taxi trials began on June 3rd, with veteran test pilot Roland Beaumont at the controls. Beaumont, who had flown the Typhoon and Meteor, treated the prototype with careful restraint. His task was to feel how the nosewheel tracked, how the brakes responded, how the jet thrust altered control sensitivity. He later recorded that the .1 handled with the steadiness of a much larger aircraft. A subtle affirmation of Petter's design balance. Taxi tests reached speeds of up to 80 knots, close to unstick velocity. Observers lined the runway margins, timing acceleration runs and watching for nose-wheel shimmy or vibration. The data returned was promising. Directional control was firm, the tricycle gear stable, and brake fade minimal. The aircraft's center of gravity, a crucial unknown in any first build, was found to be almost perfectly aligned with the predicted datum. These figures allowed flight clearance to proceed. The Ministry of Supply's representative signed off on the test summary on June 20, 1949, authorizing the transition to flight status. The prototype was repainted with small roundels and its serial number, though it still carried no unit markings. Every line from intake lip to tail cone had been verified and measured. The bomber that had begun as a classified specification in 1945 was now a tangible, functioning machine, awaiting its first flight orders. That summer, Wharton's quiet routine was transformed. Fuel trucks idled beside the hangar each dawn. Instrument teams checked barometric calibrations, and the local villagers watched as an unfamiliar silhouette began to dominate the airfield skyline. Britain's secret bomber no longer belonged to paper or policy. It was ready to rise from the ground that had shaped it. The next step, the first flight, would determine not just whether it could fly, but whether Britain still led the race it had begun. The first flight of VN 799 took place on the morning of May 13, 1949. The air was calm over Wharton, the cloud base high and visibility excellent, conditions the test team had waited weeks to secure. On the runway's edge, technicians and officials watched as the silver prototype, compact and clean-lined, taxied into position. At its controls sat Roland Beaumont, the RAF's most trusted experimental pilot, wearing the same calm expression he had carried through typhoon sorties years earlier. Behind him, the entire post-war future of British aviation was about to lift from the ground. At 07:38 hours, Beaumont advanced the throttles. The Rolls-Royce Nene engine spooled to full power, producing a combined thrust of nearly 10,000 pounds. The jet's acceleration was steady, unhurried, but relentless. As the airspeed indicator climbed through 110 knots, the nose lifted slightly. A moment later, the main wheels left the runway, and VN 799, the world's first practical twin-jet medium bomber, took to the sky. The flight lasted only 31 minutes, but it marked a turning point in aviation history. Beaumont climbed to 10,000 feet, keeping the gear down for the initial circuits. His flight report later noted that control response was entirely satisfactory, with mild stick forces and no adverse yaw. The aircraft trimmed easily in level flight, and the cockpit vibration levels were significantly lower than anticipated. Engineers recording telemetry on the ground confirmed stable engine temperatures and balanced fuel feed. The airframe behaved precisely as the wind tunnel data had predicted. At 12,000 feet, Beaumont retracted the undercarriage, a cautious step performed in stages, each verified by hydraulic pressure readings. The .1 maintained steady climb performance even as thrust was reduced to cruise setting. Its straight wings, refined at Farnborough, provided stable lift without the abrupt buffeting that had plagued earlier jets. Only the high-pitched whine of the Nenes marked this as a machine of the new age. Observers on the ground described its passage as soundless until overhead, a testament to both speed and altitude. The aircraft's first approach was deliberate. Beaumont descended on a wide circuit, flaps partially deployed, engines throttled to idle. The tricycle gear lowered cleanly, and the bomber touched down at 110 knots, rolling to a stop after less than half the runway length. No mechanical faults were reported. The post-flight inspection found only minor hydraulic seepage and a slight fuel pressure fluctuation, both typical of a first run. The data from that morning confirmed every calculation made in the years prior. The A.1 stability margins were generous, its aerodynamic efficiency impressive, and its engines dependable. In an era still haunted by piston noise and propeller torque, VN 799's flight represented silence, smoothness, and speed. It was a new sound, the hum of continuous thrust, without vibration, without propeller drag, a sonic emblem of modern air power. In the days that followed, further flights expanded the envelope. The bomber reached 35,000 feet, achieving speeds close to 470 miles per hour, faster than any operational aircraft of its size. Control harmony remained excellent, though Beaumont noted that lateral stability reduced slightly above 400 mph, suggesting the need for minor tailplane adjustment. Engine performance exceeded expectations, with fuel flow rates within predicted limits. By early June, the prototype had completed 8 test flights, each logged and analyzed by the RAE and Ministry of Supply observers. The verdict was unanimous. The design was sound, the concept proven. Britain had achieved a world first, a jet-powered bomber that could carry a meaningful payload over operational ranges. Within the ministry's internal memoranda, one phrase began to circulate: a bomber for the next war, not the last. The aircraft that began as a speculative sketch under blackout light now soared as proof of concept. The nation that had built the first jet engine but lagged behind Germany's wartime progress had now caught up, and in this design, surpassed it. As VN 799 taxied back to its dispersal, its wings still warm from the flight, the gathered engineers applauded quietly, not out of spectacle but recognition. The future had left the runway, and Britain was once again at its edge. Following the success of VN 799's maiden flight, a systematic testing program unfolded through the remainder of 1949 and into 1950. Each sortie expanded the operational envelope: higher altitudes, heavier loads, extended ranges, and each one brought refinements that would shape the bomber's evolution. What had begun as the .1 prototype was now on a clear path toward becoming the English Electric Canberra, the aircraft that would redefine Britain's post-war air power. Roland Beaumont and Wing Commander Mike Roberts alternated as test pilots, supported by engineering observers from the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, and the Ministry of Supply. Their reports describe an aircraft that combined stability with agility, rare in a bomber, and a responsiveness more reminiscent of a fighter. The .1's balanced control layout, straightforward systems, and forgiving stall characteristics gave it an advantage over contemporaries still wrestling with jet transition. Beaumont noted that its takeoff run was no longer than that of a Mosquito, while climb rates exceeded any piston-engine bomber yet flown. Incremental modifications followed each flight. Control harmonization adjustments were made to improve roll authority. The air intakes were subtly reshaped to optimize airflow into the Nene engines, and the tailplane incidence was altered by a fraction of a degree to refine trim at high speed. Engineers also identified a need for improved visibility from the cockpit during low-level approaches, leading to the distinctive clear blister canopy that would later define production models. These refinements reflected the philosophy of WEW Petter: simplicity in design, precision in adjustment, and relentless iteration based on evidence, not theory. By the end of 1949, a second prototype, VN 813, joined the program, fitted with Rolls-Royce Avon Ra.2 engines. The Avon represented the next generation of British turbojets, lighter, more powerful, and with improved high-altitude performance. With these engines, the aircraft's top speed increased beyond 500 mph, and climb rates nearly doubled. The effect was transformative. For the first time, Britain possessed a bomber that could outrun its own fighters at altitude. The Air Ministry, initially cautious, now recognized it as a strategic asset rather than a mere research tool. The redesignation came officially in May 1950. The .1 became the English Electric Canberra B.1, the first of a lineage that would soon span continents. The aircraft's purpose also shifted. No longer just a test bed, it was now a platform for Britain's emerging nuclear-capable strike doctrine, carrying conventional or special weapons across vast distances at jet speed. Within the Air Staff's planning documents, the Canberra was identified as the bridge between wartime types and the next generation of strategic bombers. Production contracts followed rapidly. English Electric's Wharton plant expanded, new tooling was installed, and subcontractors from across Britain, including Handley Page, Avro, and Shorts, were enlisted to meet projected demand. The Canberra's clean design lent itself to easy manufacture and maintenance, a stark contrast to the complex and fragile piston bombers it would replace. Its systems were modular, its structure robust, and its operational ceiling, over 48,000 feet, placed it well beyond the reach of contemporary interceptors. Each refinement flight brought small but vital insights: temperature distribution across the wing skin, trim changes at altitude, stability during asymmetric thrust. The RAE logged every data point into what became the standard reference manual for British jet bomber aerodynamics. The Canberra was no longer experimental. It was an institution in the making. By late 1950, as the world entered the uneasy balance of the Cold War, the aircraft conceived under wartime secrecy had become the symbol of Britain's new deterrent. Its lineage would soon be adopted across NATO and exported to allies from Australia to India. But here, at Wharton, its transformation was still a process of measurement, adjustment, and iteration, the quiet perfection of a design born from austerity and necessity. The bomber that never fought in the Second World War was now preparing to define the peace that followed it. By May 1951, the prototype phase had ended. The English Electric Canberra, once a paper concept coded a .1, entered official RAF service. The first production variant, Canberra B.2, was delivered to No. 101 Squadron at Binbrook, Lincolnshire. It was the dawn of a new era, the world's first jet bomber to enter frontline duty, and the machine that would define Britain's air power for the next 2 decades. The transition from prototype to operational aircraft was remarkably smooth, a testament to the disciplined design philosophy that guided its creation. Maintenance crews trained on the Canberra found systems straightforward, access panels generous, and engines reliable. The Rolls-Royce Avon Ra.3, replacing the Nene, delivered 6,500 pounds of thrust per engine and proved easy to service even in field conditions. Unlike the temperamental German Jumo 4s of wartime fame, the Avon ran clean, efficient, and predictable, the foundation on which the RAF's jet bomber doctrine would rest. Flight trials by the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment, A&E at Boscombe Down, confirmed what test pilots already suspected. The Canberra handled like no bomber before it. Its climb rate, 4,000 feet per minute, matched early jet fighters. At altitude, it could cruise at 470 knots and reach over 48,000 feet, placing it beyond the interception capabilities of contemporary piston fighters and early jets. Range exceeded 2,500 miles, sufficient for deep penetration strikes or reconnaissance far beyond Europe's borders. The RAF quickly recognized its versatility. The Canberra could carry a 6,000-pound bomb load, but with internal reconfiguration, it also became a photographic reconnaissance platform. The PR.3 variant, capable of high-altitude intelligence missions across vast distances. Its precision and endurance made it a natural fit for Britain's emerging nuclear strike role, pending the arrival of the larger V-bombers still in development. In 1952, under the Bomber Command Development Plan, the Canberra was designated Britain's primary strike platform, an interim force that would bridge the gap to the atomic age. Operational conversion training began at RAF Coningsby, where instructors noted how easily fighter pilots adapted to the Canberra's performance. Many described it as a bomber that flies like a fighter, a phrase that soon appeared in official briefings. Crews accustomed to the lumbering pace of Lancasters or Lincolns suddenly found themselves operating an aircraft that could climb faster, fly higher, and outrun interception attempts. For the first time in aviation history, the tactical assumption that bombers must be defended was inverted. The Canberra was its own defense. Its first public appearance at the 1951 Farnborough Air Show stunned foreign delegations. The Canberra performed high-speed passes that defied the category of bomber. American and French observers noted the combination of elegance and power, and within months, both nations requested demonstration flights. The United States would later adopt a licensed version as the Martin B-57, a testament to the design's adaptability and endurance. Behind the public success lay a quiet revolution in doctrine. The RAF began restructuring its squadrons around the principle of speed as survivability, a shift from defensive armament to performance. The Canberra carried no turrets, no gunners, just precision, altitude, and velocity. The simplicity of its design had become the sophistication of its philosophy. By the end of 1951, production lines at Wharton and Short Brothers in Belfast were operating at full capacity. Orders exceeded 400 aircraft, with variants already planned for specialized reconnaissance, navigation training, and electronic warfare. Britain, still recovering economically, had achieved something extraordinary: the first jet bomber in operational service, and the standard by which all others would be measured. The Canberra was more than an aircraft. It was proof that austerity and innovation could coexist. The jet bomber era had begun, and it had begun under a British roundel. By 1952, the Canberra was no longer just a British aircraft. It had become an international phenomenon. Air forces across the world, many still flying piston-engine bombers, saw in it the blueprint for a new kind of air power: clean, fast, and precise. The Canberra represented more than technology. It embodied a shift in doctrine, from massed formations to altitude, speed, and surgical strike capability. Within a few years, it would serve in over 15 air forces, spanning 5 continents. The first export agreement came from the United States, where the aircraft was evaluated under the designation XB-57. American test pilots at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base found it superior in handling and altitude performance to their indigenous designs. In a rare acknowledgement of foreign engineering, the Glenn L. Martin Company was awarded a license to build it domestically. The result was the Martin B-57 Canberra, modified for American systems and production methods. It retained the essence of Petter's design: twin engines in streamlined nacelles, mid-mounted wings, and unarmed precision, but incorporated American avionics and armament options. For the U.S. Air Force, it filled a critical gap between propeller-driven bombers and the yet-to-arrive swept-wing jet strike aircraft. Other nations followed rapidly. Australia acquired the Canberra as both a bomber and a long-range reconnaissance platform, establishing domestic production at the Government Aircraft Factory in Victoria. India, New Zealand, Argentina, and Ethiopia would follow. Each air force tailored the aircraft to its environment: tropical conditions, high-altitude airfields, or extended patrol missions. But the design's simplicity and ruggedness proved universal. It became the first jet aircraft to conduct operational bombing missions for the Royal Australian Air Force in the Malayan Emergency, and later saw combat under American markings in Vietnam. Decades after its first flight, performance data continued to astonish even as newer designs appeared. Operational service records show Canberra crews maintaining service ceilings above 50,000 feet, ranges exceeding 2,700 miles, and average serviceability rates of over 80%, figures unmatched by most early jets. Its versatility led to specialized conversions. PR.7 and PR.9 reconnaissance versions, T.4 trainers, and E.15 electronic warfare platforms. The Canberra was not just a bomber. It was a modular airframe adaptable to nearly every mission profile short of air combat. Diplomatically, the aircraft became a symbol of Britain's renewed influence in post-war aviation. The Canberra's export success restored the reputation of British aerospace at a time when economic recovery was uncertain. Each delivery flight, sometimes crossing continents, was a demonstration of reliability and reach. The RAF's display teams, flying formation over Allied capitals, turned the Canberra into an emblem of modernity, the quiet assertion that Britain remained at the forefront of aerospace engineering. In Cold War geopolitics, the Canberra carried significance beyond its airframe. It was often the first Western jet to appear in newly independent nations, aligning with NATO or Commonwealth defense structures. Its reconnaissance versions provided early intelligence coverage in politically sensitive regions. Missions over the Middle East, East Africa, and South Asia that helped establish Britain's global surveillance network long before satellites. In declassified summaries from the Air Ministry, the Canberra is described as a stabilizing influence through credible capability, understated words for an aircraft that altered regional balances without firing a shot. By the late 1950s, over 900 Canberras had been built across all variants and license agreements. It had become both the RAF's workhorse and its export ambassador. While faster, delta-winged bombers like the Vulcan and Victor began to take shape, the Canberra remained indispensable, its reliability unmatched, its record untarnished. In the skies from Lincolnshire to Lahore, one design proved that the jet bomber had not only arrived, it had globalized. By 1953, the Canberra had already proven itself as a bomber, but its greatest contribution to history would not come from its bomb bays. It would come from the precision of its cameras, mounted beneath the fuselage or within the nose of specialized variants. In the emerging Cold War, where knowledge itself became a weapon, the Canberra evolved into one of the most effective reconnaissance aircraft of its age. The Royal Air Force's No. 540 Squadron, based at RAF Benson, was among the first to receive the dedicated PR.3 and later PR.7 reconnaissance models. These aircraft carried F-52 and F-89 cameras, capable of capturing high-resolution imagery from altitudes exceeding 45,000 feet. The Canberra's stability at those heights made it ideal for long-exposure photography, and its speed allowed it to penetrate defended airspace before early radar systems could track or intercept. Mission logs describe sorties over the Arctic Circle, the Middle East, and Central Europe, always unarmed, always silent, always above the clouds. In 1954, reconnaissance Canberras undertook survey missions across the Norwegian and Barents Seas, collecting meteorological and radar mapping data under the guise of navigation trials. These flights established Britain's northern approach reconnaissance corridor, a route that would later be mirrored by US U-2 operations. Declassified Air Ministry documents confirm that the Canberra PR.7 performed strategic overflights of Eastern Bloc borders, gathering data on Soviet radar installations and air defense networks. Though not officially acknowledged at the time, the aircraft's endurance and ceiling made it one of the West's first practical tools for peacetime intelligence collection. As tensions deepened through the Suez Crisis, 1956, Canberras became essential to both reconnaissance and operational planning. Aircraft from No. 58 and No. 13 squadrons flew pre-strike photographic missions over the Sinai Peninsula, mapping Egyptian positions and infrastructure in preparation for Anglo-French operations. Their film provided the only accurate high-altitude imagery of the area, intelligence that directly shaped target selection. During the same period, Australian PR.3s operated over Southeast Asia, surveying terrain and jungle infrastructure during the Malayan emergency. Wherever the British Commonwealth maintained interests, the Canberra's lens recorded the landscape. The evolution continued with the PR.9, introduced in 1958, fitted with Avon Ra.27 engines, a pressurized cockpit, and extended wings. It could cruise at 60,000 feet, a performance range that brought it close to the operational ceiling later achieved by purpose-built spy planes. Its camera fit included long-focus oblique and vertical systems capable of detailed imagery from 30 miles away. For nearly 3 decades, the PR.9 would remain in service, the last of its kind, outliving the bombers it had once accompanied. The Canberra's intelligence missions often existed in secrecy, their records sealed for decades. Some flights over the Middle East, Africa, and Asia are still partially classified. What is known is that the aircraft's reconnaissance work contributed to mapping the early nuclear landscape, identifying test sites, airfields, and radar arrays during the most fragile years of deterrence. In an era before satellites, its silver fuselage carried the eyes of the West. The Canberra's reconnaissance success reshaped how air power was defined. No longer merely destructive, it became informational, a shift from power projection to perception control. High above the borders of ideology, a machine born in wartime secrecy had become the quiet instrument of global surveillance. It was, in every sense, the aircraft that watched the world. By the mid-1950s, the Canberra, designed in secrecy as a wartime successor, had become an instrument of Cold War strategy. Yet before the age of intercontinental bombers and nuclear deterrence fully matured, it would be drawn once again into combat. Across 3 decades and 4 continents, the jet that began as a theoretical blueprint in 1943 would fly through live fire, proving its resilience in the harshest conditions imaginable. Its first major combat deployment came during the Suez Crisis of 1956. The Royal Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, and French Air Force all operated Canberras from Cyprus and Malta, striking Egyptian airfields, radar sites, and logistics hubs. These missions, conducted from altitudes above 40,000 feet, were largely beyond the reach of Egyptian MiG-15s, whose performance degraded rapidly above 35,000. The Canberra's precision bombing runs, enabled by stabilized sights and high-altitude navigation, delivered consistent results. Although political fallout soon overshadowed the campaign, the aircraft's operational record remained exemplary. No RAF Canberras were lost to enemy action during the conflict. Following Suez, the aircraft's combat role expanded across the Commonwealth. In Malaya, Kenya, and Aden, Canberras conducted tactical strikes against insurgent positions, often from low altitude. These operations tested the aircraft's versatility. What had been conceived for strategic bombing adapted seamlessly to counterinsurgency warfare. Crews learned to exploit the aircraft's stability and visibility for precision delivery, while ground maintenance teams praised its durability under austere field conditions. The Canberra proved equally capable of high-altitude reconnaissance or close support, depending on the needs of command. By the early 1960s, the Canberra's reputation had spread far beyond British influence. The United States, having adopted the design as the Martin B-57, deployed it extensively during the Vietnam War. American B-57Bs and RB-57Es flew both conventional strike and reconnaissance missions, enduring heavy ground fire and complex weather across Southeast Asia. In U.S. service, the airframe was modified with bomb racks, ejection seats, and advanced navigation systems, but its core structure remained pure English Electric. The aircraft's performance in low-level, nighttime attack profiles earned it a reputation for toughness. Many returned to base with severe damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Elsewhere, the Canberra saw combat under Indian markings during the Indo-Pakistani Wars of 1965 and 1971. Indian Air Force Canberras struck key logistical and radar installations deep inside enemy territory, often in coordinated raids with Hawker hunters. Despite operating in contested airspace and under radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, mission success rates exceeded 90%. One of the most notable operations, the bombing of Badin Radar Station in 1971, temporarily blinded Pakistani early warning coverage, enabling successful follow-on attacks. The aircraft's combination of altitude, payload, and range made it invaluable for strategic missions in the subcontinent's demanding geography. Even as newer, faster bombers entered service, the Canberra's utility remained undiminished. Its reconnaissance derivatives continued to support combat operations by providing mapping, damage assessment, and surveillance imagery. In Vietnam, modified RB-57Fs equipped with massive extended wings and additional engines operated at extreme altitudes for atmospheric sampling and intelligence gathering, missions that bordered on the edge of spaceflight. By the end of the 1970s, the Canberra had participated in more active conflicts than any other Western jet bomber. Its design, nearly 3 decades old, had outlasted both its contemporaries and many of its replacements. What began as a British experiment in high-speed bombing had become a global workhorse of reconnaissance, interdiction, and precision strike. The Canberra's combat history was not one of dogfights or heroics. It was one of endurance and adaptability. Across its many wars, it demonstrated a truth first realized in that dimly lit design office of 1943, that the power of an aircraft lies not in its weaponry alone, but in the versatility of its design. By the late 1970s, the Canberra had already exceeded every reasonable expectation of its lifespan. Designed at the edge of piston-era technology, it was now flying beside supersonic jets and variable geometry strike aircraft. Yet the airframe, elegant, stable, and forgiving, continued to find new purposes long after its combat prime. Where other aircraft were retired to museums, the Canberra adapted once again, entering a final career as the backbone of Britain's research and test flight programs. At Boscombe Down, Pershore, and Whiten, a new generation of pilots took the controls of aircraft built before they were born. The Canberra T.17, stripped of armament and fitted with specialized electronic suites, became a platform for electronic warfare, and radar calibration. Its missions were not offensive but analytical, testing air defense systems, radar cross-sections, and early warning networks across the UK and NATO territories. Painted in distinctive gray and red or later matte black, these aircraft simulated enemy jammers and missile radars, allowing the RAF to train its aircrews and refine countermeasure tactics. Other Canberras entered a more secretive role. The PR.9, already known for its high-altitude reconnaissance, became a tool for atmospheric research and signals intelligence. Fitted with sensor pods, optical scanners, and radiation detectors, these aircraft operated under civilian and defense contracts alike. Declassified records from the Defense Research Agency, DRA, reveal Canberra sorties gathering upper atmospheric data over the North Atlantic and Mediterranean. Missions designed to measure radiation, weather phenomena, and satellite communication signals. The aircraft's spacious fuselage and stable flight characteristics made it a perfect testbed for systems that would later fly aboard satellites and unmanned vehicles. The Canberra also found a place in aerospace development. Modified B.2 and T.4 variants supported early trials of radar systems for the Tornado and Nimrod programs, while PR.9s assisted in validating long-range imaging sensors used in space and reconnaissance satellites. Engineers valued the airframe's reliability and predictable behavior. It provided a controlled, repeatable environment for testing technology decades ahead of its own era. The Canberra became, in effect, the flying laboratory of Britain's jet age. Through the 1980s, It served in exercises across Europe, often simulating adversary bombers or performing radar mapping tasks for NATO. Its versatility extended into meteorological research, flights through volcanic ash clouds, upper stratosphere sampling, and optical calibration. Civilian operators, such as Flight Refueling Limited and later KINTQ, maintained the last airworthy examples for experimental work, marking one of the longest continuous service records in aviation history. While other post-war aircraft faded into obsolescence, the Canberra evolved into an indispensable asset of experimentation. Its systems may have aged, but its structure and aerodynamics remained sound, a design so balanced that even modern avionics could be integrated without compromise. By the 1990s, nearly 50 years after its first flight, Canberras were still flying calibration and reconnaissance missions over Europe, Bosnia, and the Persian Gulf. In 2006, the final operational PR.9s of No. 39 Squadron RAF were retired after more than half a century of service. Their last sorties were conducted from RAF Marram, gathering surveillance data over Afghanistan. When the aircraft touched down for the final time, the runway crews applauded, not for sentimentality but for respect. Few machines had served so long, across so many roles, without ever losing their integrity. From atomic age bomber to atmospheric research platform, the Canberra's twilight service was not a decline but a transformation. It had become what its designer, WEW. Petter, always intended, a pure expression of aerodynamic logic, endlessly adaptable, quietly indispensable. The jet that never fought in the war it was built for had become, by its end, the aircraft that defined nearly every war and peace that followed. When the last Canberra shut down its engines at RAF Marram in 2006, the sound that faded from the tarmac was more than the end of an aircraft's service. It was the closing note of a design philosophy that had shaped an entire generation of aviation. The Canberra's lineage did not end with its retirement. It echoed through every jet that followed, from Britain's V-bombers to modern reconnaissance platforms. Its influence became structural, doctrinal, and cultural, a legacy measured not in hours flown, but in principles adopted. At the technical level, the Canberra established the blueprint for post-war jet bomber architecture. A clean, high-aspect wing, buried engines close to the fuselage for stability, and a pressurized cockpit enabling sustained flight at altitude. These features became foundational in later designs such as the Avro Vulcan, Handley Page Victor, and Vickers Valiant, Britain's nuclear-capable V-Force. Each of those aircraft, though vastly larger, inherited Petter's uncompromising emphasis on aerodynamic purity and system simplicity. The Canberra was the prototype of the philosophy that speed and altitude, not armament, were the modern bomber's best defense. In the realm of reconnaissance, the Canberra's high-altitude variants directly influenced the conceptual and operational frameworks for platforms like the Lockheed U-2 and SR-71 Blackbird. American intelligence officers studying Canberra performance in the early 1950s recognized the potential of a jet optimized for altitude rather than speed. Its success validated the principle that sustained, near-stratospheric flight could yield strategic intelligence without crossing into spaceflight, a conceptual bridge between wartime photo reconnaissance and the satellite era. The Canberra's modular design approach also left a deep imprint on aerospace engineering methodology. Its adaptability, from bomber to trainer to atmospheric testbed, demonstrated the efficiency of designing a flexible airframe first and assigning mission systems second. That philosophy would later define the development of multi-role jets like the Panavia Tornado and Dassault Mirage series. Engineers cited the Canberra as a model of production discipline, a jet built to be maintained, not merely flown. Doctrinally, it changed how air forces perceived strategic reach and survivability. The Canberra's introduction shifted the RAF from massed, low-altitude bombing to small-unit precision missions at high altitude. This doctrinal evolution carried forward into NATO's air strategy during the Cold War, a transition from quantity of bombers to quality of delivery. The Canberra was, in this sense, not just a machine but an argument in metal, that efficiency, speed, and height could render brute force obsolete. Its operational endurance also proved the value of balanced engineering over radical innovation. Where other experimental aircraft of the 1940s faltered in reliability, the Canberra thrived because it never overreached its materials or physics. It was a machine built within the limits of what was known, and yet it expanded those limits over half a century of evolution. Today, surviving examples sit under museum lights at RAF Cosford, Duxford, and Temora in Australia, their wings still carrying traces of the heat and dust of multiple wars. Test Canberras remain preserved at Boscombe Down, their sensor bays still wired from decades of experimentation. To walk beside one is to see the outline of modern aviation's DNA: simple, efficient, enduring. The Canberra's influence remains alive in the invisible disciplines of aviation, in reconnaissance doctrine, in systems integration, in the quiet art of designing for longevity. It proved that a single, well-conceived airframe could adapt to technology yet unborn, and that true innovation sometimes lies in restraint, not complexity. The jet that never fought the war it was built for became the silent architect of every jet that followed. The story of the English Electric Canberra begins with a contradiction. Conceived in 1943 for a war it would never enter, it emerged too late for battle yet too early to be obsolete. In that narrow margin between victory and reconstruction, it found its purpose, not in the roar of war, but in the silence of endurance. The Canberra's lifespan became a record of how one design, born of urgency, adapted to every new era that followed. When WWII first drew the concept, a twin-jet medium bomber with clean lines and minimalist systems, Britain was still committed to piston-engine warfare. Jet propulsion was a theoretical frontier, underfunded and distrusted. Yet the Canberra's very existence proved what foresight in design could accomplish. From the first flight of VN 799 in 1949 to its final operational sortie in 2006, every phase of its service mirrored the evolution of aviation itself. From propeller to supersonic, from analog to digital, from bombers to satellites. The Canberra's operational record reads like a map of the Cold War. It surveyed the Suez Canal before the invasion, photographed the Himalayas before the Indo-Pakistani conflicts, and measured atmospheric traces above nuclear test sites in the Pacific. It flew under the banners of more than 15 nations, each finding in it a role: reconnaissance, strike, calibration, or research. Its adaptability made it a constant presence even as generations of newer aircraft came and went. Where others aged into obsolescence, the Canberra aged into relevance. Its design purity, the unarmed bomber, the uncluttered form, the reliance on altitude and speed, represented a philosophy Britain would carry forward into every major aircraft program. The V-bombers, the Tornado, even the early concepts of unmanned reconnaissance platforms all bore traces of its design lineage. In that sense, the Canberra was not just an aircraft, but a doctrine embodied. The belief that control, efficiency, and engineering discipline could achieve what complexity could not. When the final PR.9s were retired, they left behind not silence but continuity. Their sensor technology lived on in satellites. Their reconnaissance doctrine evolved into real-time surveillance networks. What had once been film canisters descending under parachute was now data transmitted in seconds, but the principles were the same: observation, precision, altitude, endurance. Today, the Canberra rests in museums and private collections, its aluminum skin polished to a quiet gleam. Its cockpit dials are analog, its switches mechanical, yet the logic of its design remains modern. It reminds those who stand beneath its wings that innovation is not always about speed or spectacle. Sometimes, it is about proportion, balance, and the foresight to build for what comes next. The jet that never fought became the aircraft that outlasted wars, borders, and generations. Its engines are cold now, but its shadow remains, stretched across the tarmac of aviation history, from Wharton's rain-soaked runways to the high, clear air above the Cold War world it once watched.